So Kathy, could you read Matthew 26:57 and then 59 through 68?
Okay. Those who laid hold of Jesus led him away to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin tried to find false witness against him in order to put him to death, but they could not find it, although many false witnesses came forward. Later, two came forward and said, "This fellow said, I can destroy the temple of God, and in 3 days I can build it again." The high priest rose and said, "Do you make no answer? What is it that these witnesses witness against you?" But Jesus kept silent. So the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the anointed one of God, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "It is I who have said it. But I tell you that from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest rent his garment, saying, "He has blasphemed. What further need have we of witnesses? Look, you have now heard his blasphemy. What is your opinion?" They answered, "He has made himself liable to the death penalty." Then they spat on his face and buffeted him, and some struck him on the cheek, saying, "Prophesy to us, you anointed one of God. Who is he who struck you?"
Okay. When I was preparing for this, I was surprised at how much meat was here. Usually when I'm going through this, I can skip this part, I can skip that part. I didn't want to skip anything through here. There's so much stuff. And Barclay starts off with the process of the trial and says it appears to be in 3 different parts. And the first part took place after the arrest in the garden during the night at the high priest's house. And that's what's described in this section. And then the second part we'll read in a little bit. And then the third part is what took for Pilate. And he said one of the key things here was whether this meeting during the night was an official meeting of the Sanhedrin, or was it merely preliminary? And says on the whole, it looks like the Sanhedrin violated their own rules, especially if this was an official meeting. And Matthew appears to be saying that this was an official meeting, because in verse 59, he states that the whole Sanhedrin sought for a false witness to put Jesus to death. So this is the way it was supposed to work. The Sanhedrin had 71 members made up of scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, and elders of the people, and was presided over by the high priest. A quorum for something like this was 23. All criminal cases had to be tried during the daytime. Criminal cases could not be transacted during Passover season at all. Only if the verdict was not guilty could a case be finished on the day it was begun. Otherwise, it had to go overnight so that people could come to their senses, so to speak, if feelings of mercy might come. And further, no decision of the Sanhedrin was valid unless it met in its own meeting place, the Hall of Hewn Stone in the temple precinct. All evidence had to be guaranteed by 2 witnesses separately examined. False witness was punishable by death. And the witnesses were supposed to be, informed of that. And still further, in any trial, the laying before the court of all the evidence of innocence had to start before anything about guilt was shown. So these are the Sanhedrin's own rules, and every single one of them was broken here. So
I was going to say, it sounds like every single one was definitely broken.
Yeah. So to me, that just, when when people of, you have to assume some level of education. I mean, these are not, uneducated workers. These folks have been educated. The level of hatred that this, to me anyway, was it hatred? Was it fear? What's in these, like you said, a minimum of 23 people? What's going on with them? What do you think?
Well, early on, they were saying that they didn't want to do anything during the Passover. They were really afraid of what the crowds might do if they saw them arresting Jesus. And so they're kind of hiding away and trying to get this done before anyone notices, but they are even doing it around the Passover time, and that's not legal either, to do any kind of judging like that during that time.
I wonder if what's going on is really fear. That fear is usually what's behind anger. And so Jesus has brought a new covenant, is bringing a new covenant, a new view, a new world. And change generates fear. We oftentimes, when we're faced with change, we oftentimes try to hold on to what's familiar, So I think it's a lot of fear.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So the main business of this meeting this night was to formulate a charge against Jesus. And for a long time, they couldn't even find two false witnesses to agree. And then they came up with a charge that Jesus said he would destroy the temple and rebuild it. Now, obviously, this is a twisting of what he has said. And also remember, they've got to find a charge that will make the Romans willing to kill Jesus. Because as long as it's just a religious issue, Pilate's going to just say, oh, go back and take care of it yourself. But they've got to find something that Pilate is going to consider serious enough to warrant crucifixion. So they've twisted his words, and so the charge is deliberately and maliciously misrepresenting what Jesus has said. And so Jesus is in front of the high priest, and then the high priest asked his vital question. And I'm reading directly from Barclay here. We have seen that repeatedly Jesus warned his disciples to tell no one that he was the Messiah. How then did the high priest know to ask the question, the answer to which Jesus could not escape? It may well be that when Judas passed on information against him, he also told the Jewish authorities about Jesus' revelation of his own messiahship. It may well be that Judas had deliberately broken the bond of secrecy which Jesus had laid upon his disciples. I've been watching one of the great courses series done by Bart Ehrman in the last couple of weeks, and he actually talked about this in one of the lessons that I saw this week, that when Judas betrayed him, it wasn't just to tell the high priest where Jesus was, it was to give them a crime, because nothing Jesus had done yet was criminal. And so Judas also had to, and I'd never thought about it until Bart Ehrman said it. And I read this and Bart Ehrman said it, and I went back to whoa, so it's, two different places. Judas also had to give him the crime.
I hadn't thought of that either.
Yeah, they didn't have anything to charge him with. They may be afraid of him, but being afraid of somebody is not illegal.
Right.
So that was part of what happened here as well. So anyway, the high priest asked the question and asked it under oath, are you the Messiah? Do you claim to be the Son of God? And Barclay says Jesus could have said no, that would have been the end of it. We'd all be pagans. But he said yes, signed his own death warrant. And Barclay supposes that maybe Jesus paused for a moment to, really get a handle on what he was walking into. And then the Sanhedrin just lost it, spitting on it, hitting him. They even forgot to pretend to be just. And it just turned into a frenzied display of hatred. And then Barclay says, to this day, when people are brought face to face with Christ, they either hate him or love him. They either submit to him or desire to destroy him. There's no middle ground.
I'm not sure I agree with Barclay on that, but
I think issues like I know plenty of people in that middle ground.
yeah, just right. So I'm not condoning what the Sanhedrin did by any means, but the question really hit me also, in addition to realizing Judas had to give them information to suggest a crime, but if they had not behaved in this way, would we have had the crucifixion? Would the crucifixion have occurred?
Well, I think they could have manipulated things into crucifixion without being quite so blatantly breaking their own rules.
Or does the end justify the means? The end, crucifixion,
Right.
justify the means to get there.
Yeah.
Or did God know it all anyway, and he just set them all up? I mean,
Yeah, because Jesus has been saying this is going to,
happen.
right, this is going to be happening. This is going to be happening. This is going to be happening.
Yeah, what if it didn't? What if the Jews just, oh, Jesus, there's the Messiah, yay.
Yeah, what?
Well, that's an interesting alternative history book to be written. What if they had said, hallelujah?
God would have found another way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, any other comments about that part?
Jesus said the crucifixion was all about to prove who he was. So could that have been proven, and Christianity take off if it were not for the crucifixion? And the Sanhedrin was the government of the Jewish people. I mean, they.
Right.
So as we see in all governments, for thee and thee, but not for me, going on lately, governments are corrupt. I don't care what country you live in or where you're at, and the Sanhedrin was very corrupt. They were getting rich and they didn't want anybody to upset the apple cart. So that's why they had to get rid of Jesus.
Mhm.
Yep.
Hmm.
Okay, I'm going to ask Tom to read the next scripture. I gave it to you.
Oh, yeah, or that is.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
This is Matthew 27, verses 1 and 2, and verses 11 through 26. When the morning came, all the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. So they bound him and led him away and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor put the question to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said to him, "You say so." While he was being accused by the chief priests and the elders, he returned no answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear the evidence that they are stating against you?" Jesus answered not a single word, so that the governor was much amazed. At the time of the feast, the governor was in the habit of releasing one prisoner to the crowd, a prisoner whom they wished. At that time, he was holding a very well-known prisoner called Barabbas. So when they were assembled, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you wish to release to you? Whom do you wish me to release to you? Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" For he was well aware that they had delivered Jesus to him because of malice. While he was sitting on his judgment seat, his wife sent a message to him. "Have nothing to do with this just man," she said, "for today I have had an extraordinary experience in a dream because of him." The chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for the release of Barabbas and the destruction of Jesus. "Which of the two," said the governor, "am I to release to you?" "Barabbas," they said. "What then," said Pilate to them, "am I to do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" "Let him be crucified," they all said. "What evil has he done?" he said. They kept shouting all the more, "Let him be crucified." When Pilate saw that it was hopeless to do anything, and that rather a disturbance was liable to arise, he took water, washed his hands in presence of the crowd. "I am innocent of the blood of this just man," he said. "You must see to it." All the people answered, "Let the responsibility for his blood be on us and on our children." Then he released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus scourged and handed him over to be crucified. Woo! That was tough.
Yeah.
Probably mostly untrue too.
Okay, Harold, keep talking.
I mean, there is no historic record of Pilate ever doing such a thing. And
Right.
Pilate was the most mean, merciless person in the universe. So he's not about to go to, all that for Jesus, no matter what. And there's just no historic records anywhere of that type of thing going on. So, well, I don't know where it came from, but an awful lot of people feel it's fabricated to make a point.
Right.
And maybe to go after the Sanhedrin as the villains. But
Well, how was it decided then?
Well, I think, and a lot of what Harold just said has also was in this Bart Ehrman course that I've been watching. And one thing about it too is that the word Barabbas means son of the father. That just doesn't
I
mean
just
anything.
realized the word Abba is in Barabbas.
Yeah, it's son of the father, so it doesn't say anything.
Anonymous.
Yeah, kind of anonymous. Now, Barclay, who goes on the assumption that this actually happened, points out that Barabbas may have been known as Jesus Barabbas because Jesus was a very, very common name at that time. And that somewhere in there, Pilate says, Jesus known as the Christ, as if he's differentiating him from another Jesus who could have been Jesus Barabbas. But Pilate was, give you an example of just how nasty he could be. Caesarea was the seat of government that governed Judea, but during Passover, the governor came into Jerusalem to kind of help keep the peace. And they carried standards. And standards were not flags, they were poles, and the poles had images of the emperor. And while they were in Caesarea, these standards, these poles had that image. Previous governors, when they came into Jerusalem, would remove the images of Caesar because they understood how incite, or how, that could incite a riot. They were careful of the Jewish sensibilities about not having a graven image. And Pilate just went, I'm not doing that. So he brings in these poles with the image of Caesar and just really irritates everybody.
Hmm.
And Barclay also talks about, he gives some background about some of the rules that Pilate had to be at least 26 years old, or 26 or 27, because that was the minimum age. And he must have been, quite the climbing of the ladder. And another example, later, Pilate decided Jerusalem needed a better water supply, which was a good decision, but he raided the temple treasury to pay for it. So that really upset people. We have talked about Philo in the past. Philo was not a Jew, but he was a Jewish. Well, this is he was. He was not a Christian. He was a Jewish scholar, and the Jews, according to Philo, threatened to exercise their right to report Pilate to the emperor for his misdeeds. This threat exasperated Pilate to the greatest degree possible, as he feared lest they might go on to an embassy and might impeach him with respect to other particulars of his government. Like Harold said, the corruption, he insulted people, he was cruel, continual murders of people untried. I mean, just a long list of how he was a bad governor. So he was, on the one hand, he was cruel and, didn't care what he did, but on the other hand, he had to maintain some level of quiet to keep his job, even though he had no respect for anybody there.
So what are we thinking here, that the story, you're saying this story isn't true, but do we think that Pilate just wasn't as sympathetic? Because the Romans did crucify Jesus, right?
Right.
I mean,
yeah.
And we're just thinking that Pilate was shown as a sympathetic character here, and we're saying that the falsehood is that he wasn't.
Right.
Saying,
And something that we studied somewhere in the past was that as time went on, and the Jews were having to live under Roman rule, that as they developed these stories over time, and that there was an effort to make the Romans look less oppressive. They were trying to placate the Romans, and that's why they're shifting the blame from Rome to the Sanhedrin. So that when Rome starts reading this, if Rome ever does, that they won't see it as inciting to riot. We studied that somewhere. I don't remember where.
And yet the sacking of the stealing of the treasury from the temple was one of the primary last straws for the zealots, which, that revolution was the cause of the destruction of the temple in 70. So
Yeah.
it was Pilate's actions that started that whole movement of the zealots. And then Pilate, I've read somewhere, Pilate, after all this, was removed and sent to Gaul, which was no place anybody wanted to be sent to. So this whole thing didn't have a happy ending for him either. But he called, and I think probably because it was his actions of stealing from the temple that started the revolt by the zealots.
Yeah, and I'm assuming this is all just myth, but I like this, that when Pilate was recalled, and this is from Barclay, I'm on the bottom of page 419. When Pilate was on his way to Rome, Tiberius the emperor died, and it appears Pilate never got to trial, and that in the end he committed suicide. His body was flung into the Tiber River, but the evil spirit so troubled the river that the Romans that the Romans took his body to Gaul and threw it into the Rhone. And the same thing happened there. And so he actually was put into, buried in a pit in the mountains. And so apparently there's somewhere opposite Lucerne, there's a hill called Mount Pilatus. Yeah, we do come up with legends.
Yeah, a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about we really need to study the history, actual history of the Jewish people during this time, I remember reading something about when the temple was destroyed, or before the temple was destroyed, that the particular Roman captain or whatever that was responsible for making that decision tried not to have to do that, but something that the Jewish people did, or the zealots or whatever did, forced the issue. And he says, tear it down, you know. So it'll be interesting, because I think that that's one of the books that we have, you know, after in the new year, to kind of study that history and see, you know, what happened or what they think happened from history.
Yeah, I'm also watching a different great courses on Jewish history taught by a professor at the Jerusalem University, at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So I'll take notes as I get closer to that, because he's starting all the way back to Adam and Eve. So okay.
I was looking at Craddock and Boring, the People's Commentary about this passage, and they make the point about how Matthew in these verses is contrasting the Jewish guilt and Gentile innocence in this process. And I just hadn't thought of it in quite those distinct kind of terms, that for Matthew, that's a point that he's making in this, is the Jewish guilt and Gentile innocence in this process.
Yeah.
It's only in Matthew that is emphasized in this way.
Well, that would make sense, because Matthew's the only gospel written to a Jewish audience.
Mhm.
So, you know, the others might not have mattered to them.
Well, that's why we hate the Jews. You know.
Yeah, that it's been used to,
Yeah, that's been used to justify anti-Semitism. Yeah.
yeah.
No,
What
Sarah,
percent-
please. Okay. Sarah, when you asked me to read this passage, we skipped over verses 3 through 10, and that's basically the story of Judas and the 30 pieces of silver and the potter's field. I guess we'll get to that later in the.
Or we already did it.
Oh, you did? Was I asleep during that very portion?
Yeah, Barclay, like he reorganized Matthew in the whole
Yes.
Passion story. He reorganized it.
About 3 weeks ago, we studied all of the Judas parts of Matthew 26 and 20, and also 27.
Right, because that's
Yeah.
in Matthew only also, about the, Judas repenting, I guess.
Tom,
Yeah.
You said something and all I saw was lips moving and the microphone cut you out. I'm not sure.
Oh.
Right at the beginning.
Oh, the missing portions of the scripture that I was reading was the story about Judas, the 30 pieces of silver, and the potter's field.
Mhm.
Is it known what percentage of the population was Jewish?
Population, what?
Of that area where Jesus was preaching and so forth?
I would think a very high percentage. No Muslims for sure.
Yeah,
Well,
I think wasn't most of Galilee, the northern kingdom and southern kingdom Jewish? I mean, we're talking about Israel here, so. I mean, not that there weren't some Greek merchants and stuff and other people all mixed in, but I think most all were Jewish.
Yeah, I think so too.
At least they had a tremendous amount of power at the time for the Romans to make accommodations for
Yeah.
Jewish practices and stuff,
Yeah,
except for people like Pilate and
I
Yeah.
think
Herod.
up in the Galilee, up in that area though, weren't there, there was a lot of commerce going
Mhm,
that
mhm.
area, Capernaum, and so a lot of probably different people coming through, but more transient, I would think.
Yeah.
yeah,
Apparently, I'm sort of like Susan, guessing that there were more Gentile population, non-Jewish population up towards Galilee and stuff than maybe in Jerusalem itself. And of course, right now it's Passover, so there's like 2 million Jews gathered in Jerusalem,
Well,
which
Caesarea
continues
was,
to amaze me.
yeah, Caesarea was, yeah, a town of about, I think they said 1,700 or so people, and they called it a very much a Jewish town, even though there was a lot of trading going on there. And I don't know, it's
Yeah.
I don't think it was 100%, but I think it was mostly Jewish. Yeah. And you know, you think about 4 of the disciples came from Caesarea.
Uh-huh.
So anyway.
Yeah. Good point.
yeah. Okay, back to myth and what have you. Barclay actually includes something that was written from in the Acts of Peter and Paul, one of the Gospels, or that did not make it into our Bible. And I'm not going to read it to you, but there's a supposed report that Pilate made to Claudius, the emperor, about this issue with Jesus. So I thought it was interesting that Barclay included that. And then Barclay goes on, and this is more stuff that I had trouble swallowing here, but he says this whole passage gives the impression of and this is talking about Pilate, of a man fighting a losing battle. It is clear that Pilate did not wish to condemn Jesus. Yeah, right. Number one, Pilate was clearly impressed by Jesus. Pilate sought some way of escape, and Pilate sought to escape the responsibility for condemning Jesus. And we've pretty much covered that already.
I do agree with that, that I think Pilate was trying to, if this occurred, you know, Pilate was trying to find a way to get out of this mess. He didn't want to deal with it.
Right, just for political reasons and not necessarily because he had any sympathy toward Jesus.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
But it, you know, I guess I've missed it before. The statement that Herod's wife sent, Pilate's wife sent a message about how she had a dream. And so Craddock and Boring also made the point about how, you know, think about the other times in Matthew where dreams have been a way of the Spirit speaking, like Joseph's dream, you know, to go to Egypt. So anyhow.
Yeah, and Matthew draws on history. So think about dreams from the Old Testament that may have, you know, influenced his way of telling the story.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That dreams were very much a part of the Jewish literature, their Jewish writings. Yeah.
Yes.
I
Okay.
thought it was kind of interesting that Pilate refers to Jesus as, what was it, an honest man? And then
Just
says,
man.
a what man?
Just.
Honest, just man. But go ahead and give him what, 50 lashes? Hello? Yeah, not guilty, 50 lashes. What? I mean, makes no sense.
Yeah, I know.
Sounds like a man on a fence, doesn't know which way to fall.
he's playing both sides is what he's doing.
Mhm.
You know, I know we can't convict him, but I got to keep the mob happy. So I'll split the difference and, you know, give him 50 lashes.
Or
Right.
maybe that was just a part of the crucifixion process. You had to be slashed up before they put you on the cross.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the 50
Well, at that
lashes,
point, he didn't decide to crucify him, I don't think. At that
Yeah.
point, he just wanted to beat him.
but remember, 50 lashes was pretty much a death sentence.
Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, the next section gets into that. So let me read these verses. It's just a little section. This is verses 27 through 31. Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus to the military headquarters and collected to him the whole of the detachment. They stripped him of his clothes, put a soldier's purple cloak on him, and they wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head. And they put a reed in his right hand, and they knelt in front of him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spat on him and took the reed and hit him on his head. And when they had mocked him, they took off the cloak, clothed him in his own clothes, and led him away to crucify him. So did the last section that Tom read, was that where he was scourged? The description of the scourging, you know, it makes my skin crawl. And if you saw the Passion of Christ that Mel Gibson did years and years ago, that was quite graphic in that movie. That the leather strips that they used to beat you had bits of bone and metal, you know, so that your back was just raw meat by the time they put you up there. And that some people died then, never made it to the cross. They were going to be crucified. Some of them lost consciousness. Some of them went mad in this process. And if you did survive this and were put up on a cross, you know, you had no way, you know, your back is open, so the gnats and the flies are you know, chewing on you. So in addition to suffocating because you can't breathe, the pain of your back and the irritation with those animals, with the insects, is also just adding to the agony.
Yeah, accounts said that they were actually cut. Often you could see the bones and the organs. That's how deep the cuts were and how many of the cuts were. So, I mean, back then nobody was going to survive that, you know, even if they didn't go to the cross.
Yeah.
Oh, my stars, and think that he was in that condition and survived for 3 days.
Yeah.
I wonder, were there women that were ever crucified?
It's an interesting question.
Hmm.
I mean, we've read about women being stoned to death. That's an interesting thing to think about.
Or maybe they were given more sophisticated punishments like being burned at the stake.
All right, I'm looking it up. Oh, somebody else has asked that question.
Yeah, we can't possibly be the first people wondering things.
Apparently there were some incidents. So that's just a real cursory
Yeah.
look, but apparently there were.
Mm.
Josephus reported an incident where Tiberius explicitly ordered a woman to be crucified. So I'm guessing gender was one of the arguments raised in support of clemency. So anyhow, yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that research. In this section, Barclay talks about the soldiers' mockery, and he makes the point that none of these soldiers would have been Jewish because the Jews, you know, Kathy was talking earlier about how the Jews got certain concessions from the Roman government because, you know, their numbers were so large in this part of the world. and they were exempt from military service, so that the soldiers would not have been local people, very possibly, most probably, had never heard of Jesus and were just following orders. So Barclay is very lenient toward them and saying that, they're just doing their job. And there was no malice in their heart, no hatred toward Jesus as they did their job. So he let them off pretty well. He did give a little bit of history about the crucifixion and said that, and now I can't, it originated in Persia, and from its origin came from the fact that the earth was considered to be sacred to the Persian, to Ormuzd, the god, and that's why the criminal was lifted up from the earth to die, so that he did not defile the earth, which was the god's property. And from Persia, crucifixion passed to Carthage in North Africa, and from Carthage, Rome learned it, although the Romans kept it exclusively for rebels, runaway slaves, and the lowest type of criminal. It was indeed a punishment which was illegal to inflict on a Roman citizen. And then he says, Klausner goes on to describe the criminal was fastened to his cross, already a bleeding mass from the scourging, and then he hung to die of hunger, thirst, and exposure, and unable to defend himself from the torture of the gnats and flies.
And if they didn't die soon enough, they would come along and break their legs so that they couldn't support that to suffocate even faster. So.
And then they left them, and we'll hit this, which reminds me, let me say this before, because we're about to run out of time. Next week, I'll be teaching, but I'm not going to do Matthew, because I think, attendance might be a little low with being the day after Christmas. I've got some Christmas stories, Christmas quizzes, and I'd like, if you're coming next Sunday, to come with a story about Christmas from your youth or your children's youth, a funny story about Christmas that's yours for next week. And so with that, it's 10:51. I'm going to say Merry Christmas. I hope to see some of you in church Christmas Eve. And for the rest of you, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year if I don't see you for another couple of weeks.